The purpose of this video is to explain our analysis as to why we are flooding. We're also going to touch on some historical things that's happened in the watershed that we believe are contributing to the flooding problems, including projects that have had some unintended consequences. The flood types we experience in our watershed include a major river flood. During Hurricane Barry, believe it or not, we were dealing with a major river flood because one of our main drains for our watershed is the basin. And the major river floods that were happening on the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya were causing the basin levels to be so high as to our drainage gate up at Bayou Catawba was completely closed. We could not open it because the water would have backflowed into our watershed out of the basin. We also deal with storm surge floods. Again, Barry. There was a reported storm surge of over 12 feet at Sycamore Point down on Vermilion Bay. And we deal with major rainfall event floods. The rainfall event in August of 2016 is a classic major rainfall event where over 20 inches of rain fell over the wide areas of the watershed. All right, let's talk about our watershed. This is the Teche Vermilion watershed. It is comprised of about a million acres, and it extends north all the way north of Alexandria to the town of Boyce, Louisiana. It's bounded on the west side roughly by I-49, on the east side roughly by the Red River and the west Atchafalaya Spillway West Guide Levee, which you may know as the Henderson Levee. A recap of the flood numbers for August of 2016. This watershed we just showed, the Teche Vermilion, according to the State Senate, had approximately 10,375 homes flooded. Louisiana had 84,900 homes flooded. That number I've seen on some more recent data to be in excess of 100,000 homes. And businesses were impacted also. The businesses may be impacted if a business owner, a key employee, or any employee that contributes to the productivity of the business home wasn't flooded, and they have to take time away from the business to deal with their home. And in Louisiana, the FEMA flood insurance payouts, the grants and loans were over $4 billion. And some of y'all may have seen revised flood maps that will increase flood insurance rates if you now live in a zone other than X. Where do we get these numbers? This came off the State Senate website. They had numbers for most of the parishes down in South Louisiana. We picked up a number from Rapides from a visit up there with the police jury of around 500 homes. The risk we deal with, again, the basin levels dictate the effectiveness of the Bayou Catawba drainage gates. During Hurricane Barry, they were completely ineffective until the 20 inches of rain they got right north of Lafayette overwhelmed the land side, and the level on the land side of the levee actually got higher than the basin side. They were finally able to open up the gates and drain some of the water into the basin. We could not pre-empty draining Bayou Catawba into the basin prior to Hurricane Barry because the levels in the basin were too high. The Vermilion River is one of our main drains for the watershed. So we're going to talk a little bit about historically what's happened on the Vermilion. We had 11 12-foot flood events from 1940 to 1980, approximately 40 years. We had 7 12-foot flood events in the last 24 months. And we've had 5 12-foot flood events since January 1st of 2019. If the Vermilion River was a canary in the coal mine, he would be drowning. So why are we flooding? Pretty much all the water that flows, that rainfall that happens in the watershed, has to drain out to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, we'll talk about historically what we found in our research regarding projects that may have had unintended consequences and how they impact the drainage and the flooding situation in the watershed. Up in Alexandria, they used to drain quite a bit of their water up there through these gates into the Red River. These gates are on Bayou Rapides, right in the middle of Alexandria. This is the Red River on this side. This is Bayou Rapides, and these are the gates. Well, when they made the Red River navigable, they raised the pool stages in the Red River. So these gates became ineffective, largely ineffective. And at that time, they started having flooding problems up here in Alexandria. And this was confirmed by visits up there and communications with the parish engineers as to when their problem started. In fact, the problem has become so severe that the mayor in Alexandria was elected on a promise to address the flooding situation by installing $120 million worth of pumping systems to pump water into the river because it can no longer gravity flow due to the higher stage in the river. An unintended consequence of the Red River Navigation Project. So where does that water go now? Well, it comes back around the Shetland Lake Canal and through a series of bayous and ends up in Bayou Catawba. We're going to talk about Bayou Catawba here in more detail here in a minute. That bayou's down in St. Landry Parish. Okay, over in Bourlonville, Louisiana, there was a floodgate right here. It was called the Bourlonville Floodgate. It was damaged in some floods around 1973, and subsequently it was closed. This particular floodgate drained Bayou de Glace, which has a watershed of 270 square miles, which is actually larger than all of Lafayette Parish. So you can see over here on this side, this is the downstream side. They put an earthen dam and a concrete retaining wall, and they abandoned this structure. So what happens to the water now? So where does it go? It can no longer go through this drainage structure down to the Atchafalaya River. If this structure would have been open during the flood of 16, we could have drained off a tremendous volume of water that came from the north down to us in the south, because the river, this side over here, was very, very low levels during the flood of 16. So now the water goes down what they call the Bayou de Glace diversion channel, and it hits the West Atchafalaya Spillway Levee over here, and its borrow pit, they call it Bayou Amy on the southern part of the watershed, and it goes straight down to Bayou Catawba. So what happens in Bayou Catawba? So we're getting all this water coming down to Bayou Catawba. It has a gate on the Henderson Levee, the West Atchafalaya Spillway West Guide Levee. There it is right there. And it can drain Bayou Catawba right here to the basin, if the basin levels are low enough, okay? The second thing is, look at the size of these gates in relationship to the size of the bayou. In the report to the Mississippi River Commission in 2007, the Corps of Engineers addressed this issue, saying these gates were dramatically undersized and needed to be increased in size to handle more volume of water. An unintended consequence of the test for million freshwater district was they raised the level in Bayou Catawba to make the test for million work. Okay, they did not facilitate, by putting a gate here, any kind of ability to preempt draining this high level of water that's maintained in Bayou Catawba to make test for million work in the event of a threat. They have a very small culvert in there, like 54 inches. It's only there to provide a little bit of fresh water in Bayou Amy. It is not effective for any kind of flood prevention efforts. So the unintended consequence was not designing a gate here to allow you to lower the level of Bayou Catawba when there is a threat to the area. The level on this side typically is 1 foot above sea level, about the same as Lake Falls Point. So you've got a tremendous head here. The level on this side is typically 16 or greater. So you can, drain a tremendous amount of water through a relatively small gate right here on the levee. So we got all this water from Alexander, all this water from Rapides Parish and Evalds Parish, all coming down to Bayou Catawba. Now, there is an overflow where, in an uncontrolled situation, if too much water gets in there, it can overflow and it goes down to Borrow Pit or Bayou Amy to Lake Foss Point. This is Lake Foss Point. This particular lowland swamp area is probably the major floodplain in our watershed. A floodplain is an area that's designed to overflow when there's an uncontrolled flood. Okay, and what we have here is that this particular floodplain was built on the land side or the population side of the levee. The levee's right in here, okay? This is the basin over here. So another unintended consequence is we've allowed some of the plumbing to move the water down here to deteriorate tremendously. So we're having trouble getting the water down to our floodplain. This is what the Corps of Engineers designed originally to manage floodwaters in our watershed, and it worked very well for many years until we screwed up the plumbing. So the Bayou Teche is another main drain. And oh, by the way, the Lake Foss Point area does drain back into the Bayou Teche and out into the Gulf through the Baldwin Canal. And the Vermilion River drains through Abbeville into the Gulf. So that's basically how the water gets out of the watershed, either into the basin through those little bitty gates, or it's going to come down Bayou Teche, or it's going to come down the Vermilion River. And these two bayous are way undersized to handle the volume of water we saw in a 2016 event. Okay, another reason we're flooding is we're having some really serious problems with some of our drainage assets, such as the Grimmett Canal, the outlet between the Grimmett Canal in the basin down to the north part of Lake Henderson. Okay, the water that comes through those gates comes down here and makes its way down to Lake Henderson. This is all plugged up. A story I often tell is that clearing and snagging a lot of our bayous, that's removing trees, that's not cutting all the trees down on the bank and nothing like that. A lot of times, the last time any work like that's been done has been 50 years ago. I worked on some of those projects when I was attending college, when I was in my early 20s and late teens. And that was a long, long time ago. And I'd be willing to bet, having traversed some of these bayous, that nothing's been touched in all these years since. And they desperately need to be addressed and cleaned. And this is just one example of many, many bayous and tributaries that need attention. Okay, why are we flooding? Why are we getting such high storm surges? Okay, why did we get a crazy storm surge during Rita? Well, years ago they dredged out this oyster reef here. It was called the Point of Fur oyster reef. It was known to be the largest oyster reef in the world. It is completely gone now for the most part. So right now we have a huge, over 1 million square feet of channel that can enter the bay on the west side of Marsh Island that can overwhelm our systems and result in really high storm surges. We had approximately 12-foot storm surge over at Sycamore Point. Over on the east side, on the west side of Marsh Island, Southwest Pass has a small fraction of that channel capacity that they have on the east side. We think we need to restore this as soon as possible. This is very critical. So why are we flooding? Okay, here's a little look at one of our major drains in the Vermilion River. This is down at Perry. The channel, the authorized channel that was dredged back in the 50s is shown here, mostly in white, a little bit of pink. A pink's out of spec, the white's in spec as to depth and width. So you can see it looks pretty good down there south Perry, down at Perry, South Abbeville. Well, let's take a look at Lafayette. We have no channel in Lafayette. There's very, very little white shown on this. And then the white doesn't extend all the way across the river. In fact, there's shoals so bad here at Coulee Mean that there essentially is no channel. 100% of Lafayette Parish is out of spec, and approximately 100% of the northern Vermilion Parish is out of spec. And even down as far south as Perry, there are shoals that need to be removed. So, as a result of all these things, what's going on? You can see this is the frequency of flooding on our Vermilion River, who is our canary in the coal mine, I believe, for our watershed. They've tracked flood events on the Vermilion River since 1940. You can see here we were bumping along at a flood every 3 to 5 years. And then we took an upturn in the 70s and the 80s. And that's when some of these projects started being constructed. Then we took another dramatic upstream here in this decade, and more recently in the last few years. We believe this dramatic upturn has to do with a lot of the parishes cleaning their coulees after the 2016 flood event, before the river was cleaned out. The river just cannot handle the water. So people ask, well, is it raining more now? Well, the answer to that is yes, it is. Okay. If you look at this trend here, this is 40 years worth of rain data at Lafayette Airport. This is the blue lines of the annual rainfall. The dotted line is the trend. You can see it slopes up slightly. Down here is the maximum rain that was measured during any 24-hour period at the airport. You can see in the 40 years, the first 40 years of this data is 80 years worth of data approximately. We had less extreme rainfall events than we have now. So these extreme rainfall events, we're having trouble handling these things given the current situation we have with our waterways. So the answer to that is, yes, we're having more extreme rainfall events. It's not crazy extreme, but they are more extreme events than we've seen in the past. And that could be contributing to some of our issues also. This is the 5 floods we've had since January 1st. This is the June flood. It was over 14 feet, 14.6, I believe. It did impact several homes in Lafayette for sure. I'm not sure about the numbers, but we've had reported of some people were flooded during this June flood. And this was with 8 inches of rain. So the river just can't handle the water. This was Barry. Barry only got to 12.6, but there's a reason why. Take a look at this trend down here. We'll take a look at that a little more detail here. Okay, this is zoomed in to what happened during Barry. This was that June flood right here. Okay, and the river was draining. Well, National Weather Service said with this storm coming in, we were going to get a 15-foot crest on Barry with the predicted rainfall and the storm surge. Well, we were able to get Test Vermilion, who was pumping because we were in a low water situation in the river down here. They cut the pumps off almost a week ahead of time. And the fact that the storm stayed out in the Gulf of Mexico to the east of us for a few days allowed the north winds, because we were on the right side of the storm at the time, to blow the water out of the system. And you can see that the 3.6 foot that was recorded at Surrey is the lowest level that we've seen there. I believe this is 37 years, not 40 years. Of course, when the storm came and the storm surge came, this water got up to 12.6, which was, and nobody flooded, which was great. Okay, this proves a point of one of our major objectives is better managing our natural retention. Because when we pull this river down, what it did, it pulled down Cypress Island Swamp, which is like one of our natural retention areas from the Vermilion River. It also pulled down a lot of the Bayou Catawba swamps up north of us, which are retention areas for the by Catawba watershed up there. So it allowed that storm surge, it allowed the 20 inches of rain they had right north of us to refill those natural retention areas and lessen the impact on our area down here. A little history about the Vermilion: we experienced 3 major floods in the 40s as a result of some major projects were executed, including dredging and building those gates we looked at. And we had no additional major floods for about 65 years till 16, a major flood being 16 feet in Surrey. Will we have to experience 2 more major floods before we take action? Our guiding project recommended objectives, okay? First, divert as much water as possible out of the watershed into the rivers, into the floodways, and into our floodplain down at Lake Falls Point we showed you. Second, where possible, manage to utilize natural retention. A good example of that was what was done prior to Hurricane Barry, lowering those levels in those retention areas, draining them, and then when the rains and the storm surge came, they refilled and lessened the impact on the populated areas and the farmland. Third, we need to increase the efficiencies of the existing waterways to move the remaining water into the Gulf of Mexico. So if we can't divert it and we can't manage it, we got to handle the remaining flow as efficiently as possible. We appreciate you paying attention to the most important data, and please see our project recommendations page and video. Thank you very much.